The chandeliers at the Rourke estate were the kind that made you lower your voice without meaning to, and I spent the whole party lowering mine, hiding behind a camera the way I always did when the room held someone I used to love. I had told myself I could do this. Photograph the engagement of a family that used to almost be mine, get paid, go home, never think about it again. I had said that sentence in the mirror that morning with real conviction. It lasted exactly until Celeste Rourke walked into the ballroom in champagne-colored silk, laughing at something a woman with a shaved head and a confident jaw had said, and I felt the conviction leave my body like air out of a punctured tire. I lifted my camera and took the shot anyway. Celeste laughing, chandelier light caught in her hair, her hand resting on a stranger's forearm the way it used to rest on mine, easy and thoughtless, like touching people was as natural to her as breathing, and meant exactly as much. I checked the frame in the little screen and told myself it was a good photograph. And it was. And that was the worst part. Rain started against the tall windows an hour before the toasts. I kept working, table shots and candid laughter. I knew this family's angles by heart, still, after everything. What I didn't expect, not after 2 years of being mostly invisible to her, was to be watched back. Celeste Rourke stood near the east doorway most of the night, the way she always did at these things, half in the room and half out of it, a wine glass she never drank from loose in one hand. Black dress, no ornament, the kind of expensive that doesn't announce itself. She was 34, a defense attorney with a reputation that made prosecutors visibly recalculate, and in 2 years of family dinners I had exchanged maybe 40 sentences with her total. She had never been unkind to me. She had also never once let me relax. I felt her watching before I turned and found it. Not on Celeste, on me, on the hand I hadn't realized I'd pressed flat against my own sternum. She didn't look away when I caught her, the way most people would. She held it a beat longer, like she was confirming something, then let her gaze move on, unhurried. By the time the party thinned into its last hour, the rain had turned serious, and I stood under the portico packing my gear with my jacket soaked through, telling myself the tightness behind my eyes was fatigue and nothing else. "You're not driving in this," Celeste said. She'd come out with a coat over one arm, and her keys already in hand, like she'd decided something before she reached the door. "I have a car. You have a 9-year-old hatchback with bald tires I noticed in October." No particular emphasis, the way she probably informed juries of inconvenient facts. "I'm offering you a ride, Nora, not a proposal." I should have said no. I knew, standing there with rain soaking my collar, that getting into a car alone with Celeste Rourke had never once been a neutral decision. "Fine," I said, "but only because I don't want to die on I-84. Something almost like amusement crossed her face and was gone. She held the door. The car smelled like leather and cedar and rain. The heater was already running. We drove in silence for a few blocks, wipers ticking, streetlights sliding gold across the glass, and then I sat up straighter. "Left here," I said. "My apartment's on Fremont." She didn't turn. "Celeste, you missed it." "I know," she said, and kept driving, and the quiet in the car went from comfortable to charged in the space of one missed street. "Then turn around." "If you ask me to, I will," Celeste said, eyes on the road, voice steady. "I mean that. Say the word and I'll have you at your door in 6 minutes. I am not taking you anywhere against your will." "Then where are we going?" Her eyes flicked to me once, unhurried, certain. "Somewhere you will not pretend you are fine." I stared at her, heart going hard and strange in my chest, some humiliating part of me not frightened at all. "Excuse me? You photographed my sister for 6 hours tonight while she performed happiness at someone else," Celeste said, flat and precise, no cruelty in it, no softness either. "You smiled at my mother. You complimented the flowers. You have not, in the entire time I've known you, allowed yourself to fall apart in front of one single person in that family. I'm offering you somewhere to do that, where no one is taking notes." I didn't ask her to turn around. Before we return to the story, a quick note for my lovely viewers. While this YouTube series keeps things safe, my Patreon is where the real fun happens. That's where you'll find completely uncensored GL stories, much hotter exclusive videos, and bolder adventures that are just too spicy for YouTube. If you want the full, no limits experience, and to support more of this kind of storytelling, the Patreon link is in the description below. That was the thing I'd think about for weeks afterward. Longer than I'd admit to Marin, longer than I'd admit to myself, that in the one clear moment I had to end it cleanly, safely, before anything happened that couldn't be undone, I said nothing at all, and let the black car carry me further from everything I knew. We drove past the last of the residential streets and into the hills above the city, the rain softening to a fine mist that turned every streetlight into a smeared halo. Celeste's hands stayed loose and certain on the wheel, and I found myself watching them instead of the road. The way she signaled early, the way her rings caught the dashboard light, the way she never once looked shaken even now, doing something I was fairly sure the old Celeste, the doorway Celeste, would never have allowed herself to do. "You fixed my necklace once," I said, before I'd decided to say it. "At Christmas, 2 years ago, the clasp broke, and Brielle was busy with her cousins, and you just did it. Didn't say anything. I remember." "Why?" "Because it was broken, and you looked like you'd rather disappear than ask anyone for help," Celeste said. I recognized the expression. "From where?" She didn't answer right away. The wipers ticked twice, 3 times, before she spoke again. "From every mirror I owned between the ages of 12 and 30. I turned that over in the quiet, the same way I'd turned over the water glass she'd handed me, without a word the night Brielle forgot I existed for 45 minutes at a family barbecue. The same way I'd turned over the one warning she'd ever given me. Low and almost gentle, the winter before everything ended. "Brielle loves being loved more than she knows how to love back. Be careful what you build on that." I hadn't wanted to hear it then. I'd wanted to believe I was the exception. I usually was, in my own mind, right up until I wasn't. The road ended at a turnout above the city, guardrail slick with rain, the lights of Portland scattered out below us like something spilled and still spreading. Celeste parked, cut the engine, and for a moment neither of us moved. Rain ticked softer against the roof now, and somewhere below a siren rose and faded, and I realized my hands were shaking, not from cold. "I'm not going to cry in front of you," I said. "All right," Celeste said, and looked out at the city instead of at me, giving me somewhere else to put my eyes. "Then don't," I cried anyway. Not gracefully, not the composed, camera-ready tears I'd learned to produce for other people's benefit, but the ugly kind, shoulders shaking, both hands pressed over my mouth like I could physically hold it in, even after it had already gotten out. Celeste didn't reach for me. She didn't say anything soothing or empty. She sat with her hands still on her thighs, present and unmoving, like a lighthouse doesn't chase the boats, it just stays lit and lets them find their own way in. She looked happy, I finally managed. With that woman, genuinely happy, not performing it. And I hate that I noticed the difference, because it means some part of me has been keeping score this whole time, waiting to see if she'd ever look like that with me. She didn't, Celeste said. "Not cruel, just certain. You don't know that. I watched you for 2 years, Nora." Her voice didn't change register, didn't soften into something performative, and that was exactly what made it land so hard. "I know what my sister's happiness looks like when it's real, and what it looks like when she's decided a room needs to see it. With you, toward the end, it was mostly the second kind. I used to leave those dinners early because I didn't want to watch you figure that out in real time." "Why didn't you just tell me?" "Because it wasn't my place. Because you would have hated me for it. And rightly so. Nobody wants the older sister explaining their own relationship back to them. And because..." She stopped. "Because what?" Celeste looked at me then, fully, the streetlight through the windshield cutting her face into planes of gold and shadow, and something in her expression shifted. Some door I hadn't known was closed, easing open a crack. "Because I didn't entirely trust my own reasons for wanting to say it," she said. I didn't ask her what she meant. I think I already knew, and I think we both understood that naming it that night, in a parked car above a city that already knew too much about both our families, would have been a mistake neither of us could take back. So I let it sit there, unspoken, and wiped my face with the back of my wrist, and Celeste reached into the glove box and produced, absurdly, a small, clean towel. "For the camera strap?" she said, nodding at my bag, which had gotten soaked at the party. "It's leather. It'll warp if you let it dry like that." "You carry towels for camera equipment in your glove box." "I carry towels for several contingencies," Celeste said, already reaching for the strap without asking permission, drying it with the same careful, economical attention she probably brought to cross-examining a hostile witness. It was, I would understand only later, the most tender thing anyone had done for me in over a year, and she'd dressed it up as maintenance so neither of us would have to call it what it was. We didn't go home, not yet. Celeste drove us another 15 minutes to a narrow storefront on a street I didn't recognize, dark windows, a hand-lettered closed sign, and let herself in with a key from a ring that had no business having a key to anywhere that wasn't hers. "I helped the owner out of a very bad contract with a very bad landlord 3 years ago," she said, by way of explanation, flipping on a single light behind the counter. "He gave me a key. I've never used it before tonight." The diner smelled like coffee grounds and old vinyl, and faintly, cinnamon. Celeste moved behind the counter, still in her expensive black dress and her expensive black coat, entirely unbothered by the absurdity of it, and made a genuinely, spectacularly bad attempt at coffee. Grounds too coarse, water not hot enough, the whole production executed with the confidence of someone who had clearly never once made coffee for herself in her adult life and had people to do it for her instead. "This is terrible," I said, after one sip, laughing for the first time all night. A real laugh that surprised both of us. "It is not terrible. Celeste, it tastes like a lawsuit." "I object," she said, deadpan, and something about the joke landing from her, of all people, cracked something open in my chest that had been shut for months. I laughed until it turned back into crying, that ugly overlap where you can't tell anymore which one you're doing, and Celeste came around the counter and stood close, not touching, hand hovering an inch from my back like she was waiting for a verdict. "You can," I said. "You can touch me. I'm allowing it." Her hand landed, warm, careful, between my shoulder blades, and stayed there while I finished falling apart in a closed diner at 1 a.m, and it was the safest I had felt in longer than I wanted to admit. By the time we left the diner, the rain had thinned to almost nothing, and Celeste drove us along the river instead of straight back into the city, the water black and moving under a scatter of bridge lights. I meant to stay awake. I meant to keep some careful distance between myself and whatever this was becoming, some internal ledger balanced. Instead, the heater and the low murmur of the engine and the exhaustion of crying for the first time in months pulled me under before I could stop it, and I woke to stillness, to the car parked and the engine off, to Celeste's coat laid carefully over me like she'd taken it off her own shoulders and hadn't wanted to wake me doing it. "How long was I out?" 40 minutes, Celeste said. She was watching the river, not me, hands still resting on the wheel even though we weren't moving. "You talk in your sleep. Mostly nonsense. Something about a lens cap. Oh, God." "It was endearing," she said, and the word landed strange and careful in the quiet car, like she'd chosen it after discarding 3 better ones. I sat up, pulling her coat tighter around my shoulders, without quite deciding to, and she watched the small gesture with an expression I couldn't fully read, something between wanting and refusing to want. "You didn't have to guard the silence," I said. "You could have woken me up, or gone home. This isn't your job, Celeste." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." "Then why?" She was quiet long enough that I thought she wouldn't answer. "Because I wanted to want something for once," she finally said, low, like the sentence cost her something to produce, and this was the first time in longer than I can remember that wanting it didn't feel like it was going to cost someone else. I didn't know what to do with that, so I didn't do anything with it. I sat in her coat and watched the river with her until the sky started to go gray at the edges, and neither of us said the thing we were both very carefully not saying, and when she finally drove me home, my actual home, this time, no detours, she walked me to my door in the pale early light and stood one step back, hands in her coat pockets, giving me all the room I could possibly need to close the distance if I wanted to, and none of the pressure to do it if I didn't. "Thank you," I said, keys in hand. for not letting me be fine. Anytime, Celeste said, and something about the casual promise in that word, from a woman who did not make casual promises, followed me inside and sat with me for the rest of the week. I found her asleep, sitting upright in the one decent chair in my living room, 3 hours later, when I stumbled out for water and hadn't actually expected her to still be there. I hadn't invited her in. Not exactly. She'd asked if she could use my bathroom before the drive back across the city, and somewhere in the transition from door to hallway, I'd said something about coffee. Real coffee. Mine. And she'd said yes before I finished the sentence. She'd fallen asleep sitting straight-backed in my ugly green armchair with her coat, the one I was still wearing, technically, since she'd never asked for it back, draped over her knees instead, her face unguarded in a way I don't think I'd ever seen it, younger somehow, the permanent readiness gone slack. I didn't wake her. I stood in my own doorway for a long, stupid minute just looking, memorizing the particular curve of her jaw in morning light, telling myself it was only curiosity, only the reflexive cataloging instinct of someone who photographs faces for a living. It wasn't only that. I knew it wasn't only that, even as I lied to myself about it, standing there at 6 in the morning in a stranger's coat that didn't feel like a stranger's coat at all. I let her sleep another hour before I made noise on purpose, clattering a mug too loudly in the kitchen, and she woke instantly, fully alert in the space of one breath, the way people who've spent their careers being ready for ambush learn to wake. "I should go," she said, before I'd said anything at all, already standing, already smoothing invisible wrinkles out of a dress that had survived a party, a rainstorm, and a chair better than either of us had any right to expect. "You could stay for coffee, actual coffee, I promise. It won't taste like a lawsuit." The corner of her mouth moved, almost a smile, immediately reined back in. "I have depositions at 9. "Of course you do." At the door she paused, and for one unguarded second I thought she might close the distance herself, might do the thing neither of us had done in the car, in the diner, in the too quiet living room. But she only reached out and straightened the collar of her own coat, still on my shoulders, an entirely unnecessary adjustment that put her hand near my collarbone for 3 full seconds too long. "Keep it," she said, of the coat, voice gone rough at the edges in a way I hadn't heard from her before. "It suits you better than it suits me." Then she was gone, black car pulling away down my wet street in the gray early light, and I stood in my doorway in her coat feeling like I'd survived something and started something in the exact same breath, and had absolutely no idea, yet, how much of my life was about to reorganize itself around a woman I'd spent 2 years being told not to look at too closely. I tried to go back to normal life the way you try to fold a fitted sheet, with great confidence and no actual method, producing something lumpy and unconvincing that you shove in a drawer and hope no one examines too closely. I edited the engagement photos over the next several days at my kitchen table, cycling through 800 frames of a party I mostly wanted to forget, and kept stopping, not on Brielle, which would have made a kind of tragic sense, but on Celeste. There were more of her in the raw files than I remembered taking. My hands, apparently, had been telling on me all night, drifting the lens toward the doorway every time I lost track of what I was supposed to be documenting. Celeste watching the room. Celeste's jaw when her mother said something pointed about the wedding budget. Celeste catching my eye across the ballroom in a frame I had absolutely no memory of shooting, her expression unreadable except for the fact that it was, unmistakably, entirely fixed on me. Marin found me still at the table 2 days later, laptop open to a grid of Celeste Rourke's face in 17 different lighting conditions, and set down the takeout bag she'd brought without comment. "So," she said, "we doing this?" "Doing what?" "Nora, you've got a folder titled Misc Unsorted. That is 900 photos of one specific Rourke sister, and it is not the Rourke sister you dated for 2 years. Marin dropped into the chair across from me, stealing a spring roll before I could object. "I'm not judging. I'm just saying, as your best friend and occasional assistant, that this feels like information." "She drove me around for 4 hours instead of taking me home," I said. "That's all it was." "Uh-huh. And the coat currently living on your coat rack, which I clocked the second I walked in, and which is very clearly not from your closet. I didn't have a good answer for the coat. I still don't, honestly, except that I hadn't been able to bring myself to wash it, because it still smelled like cedar and rain and something warm underneath, and washing it felt like it would erase the only physical proof that any of it had actually happened. It's her sister, Nora, Marin said, gentler now. All the teasing dropped out of it. Her sister who broke your heart 6 months ago. I love you, and I will support whatever ridiculous decision you're about to make, but you have to at least say the sentence out loud, so we both know we heard it right. I don't know what I'm doing, I admitted, which was as close to the sentence as I could get. That tracks, Marin said, and stole another spring roll, and let it go, because that's what Marin did. She'd hold a mirror up to you exactly once, and then let you sit with your own reflection, instead of forcing the conversation, which was, I think, why I'd survived the last year with her, as my closest witness, instead of falling apart entirely. Celeste showed up at my studio 9 days later, with a legal envelope she absolutely did not need to deliver in person. This could have been mailed, I said, when I opened the door and found her on my landing, in a charcoal blazer, envelope in hand, an expression on her face like she'd already anticipated, and rejected several better excuses before settling on this one. It could have, she agreed. So why are you here? Because I wanted to see you, Celeste said, plainly, no defensive dressing on it at all, and the honesty of it startled me more than a lie would have. The envelope is real. It's paperwork releasing the studio from any claim related to a guest's champagne flute breaking against my mother's rug. It could genuinely have waited a week. I brought it today because I've spent 9 days telling myself I wasn't going to, and losing that argument every morning around 10 a.m. I let her in. Of course I let her in. I'd been losing a version of that same argument for 9 days too, staring at a coat rack, cycling through the same 17 photographs like they might rearrange themselves into an answer if I looked hard enough. She stood in my cramped studio, surrounded by drying prints and a wall of client contact sheets, entirely out of place in her tailored blazer, and looked, for one unguarded second, almost nervous, which I hadn't known was a register she had. I can't keep doing this, I said, before I'd fully decided to say it. If it's only going to happen when I'm falling apart, I don't want to be a person you show up for once a season, when something's already gone wrong. I've been that person before, Celeste. I know exactly what it costs. Something shifted across her face, not offense, more like recognition, like she'd been braced for a different accusation and gotten a fairer one instead. That's not what this is. Then what is it? I don't entirely know yet, she admitted, and it might have been the first time I'd heard Celeste Rourke say those 4 words about anything. I know I think about you more than a person in my position should. I know I drove past your street twice last week without a reason to. I know I told myself the envelope was an excuse, and I still drove here anyway, because some part of me apparently decided an excuse was better than nothing. She stopped, visibly reining herself back in, the courtroom composure sliding back over her features like a door easing shut. I'm not going to make this complicated for you, on top of everything else. If you want me to stop showing up, I will. I didn't say that. No, Celeste said, watching me carefully. You didn't. She started finding reasons after that, and stopped pretending they were the point. A forgotten lens cap she returned in person instead of leaving with my downstairs neighbor. A recommendation for a courthouse gala that needed a photographer, with, in her words, actual discretion, which is rarer than talent in this business. That was how I ended up at the Multnomah County Bar Association's spring benefit 3 weeks after the party, camera in hand, watching Celeste Rourke operate in her natural habitat for the first time. It was a different woman entirely from the one who'd made bad coffee in a closed diner. Here, in a marble lobby strung with warm light, she moved through a crowd of judges and prosecutors, and men who clearly wanted her on their side of a courtroom and were terrified of the alternative, with an authority that didn't ask permission from anyone in the room. I watched a district attorney visibly recalibrate mid-sentence when Celeste joined a conversation she hadn't been part of 30 seconds earlier. I watched a senior partner at some enormous firm defer to her on a point of procedure with something close to relief in his voice, like he'd been hoping someone smarter would show up and settle it. She's terrifying, I said to the caterer refilling glasses near my station, mostly to myself. She got my cousin's conviction overturned pro bono because the prosecution withheld evidence, the woman said, not even looking up from the tray. Terrifying's one word for it. I photographed Celeste from across the room the way I'd photographed her at the party, helplessly, more than the job required, and this time, when she caught me doing it, she didn't just hold my gaze and let it go. She crossed the room instead, unhurried, magnetic in a way the entire crowd seemed to feel and part for without being told to, and stopped close enough that I had to tip my chin up to keep looking at her. "You're supposed to be photographing the event," she said, low, "for me only." "I am. You're technically part of the event. Is that your professional assessment?" "It's my honest one," I said, and watched something flicker behind her composed expression, want and restraint, doing silent battle in real time. We ended up, 20 minutes later, in the service elevator together, ostensibly because she was walking me to the loading entrance to retrieve a second camera bag, and the doors closed on a space barely large enough for the two of us and my equipment, mirrored on 3 sides, so that wherever I looked, there she was, multiplied, inescapable. "This is a very small elevator," I said. "It is." Neither of us moved toward the buttons. The car hummed, stationary, and Celeste's eyes moved over my face with a kind of open hunger. She usually kept locked down so thoroughly I'd started to wonder if I'd imagined it in the car that first night. Her hand came up, slow, deliberate, and stopped an inch from my jaw, exactly the way it had hovered near my back in the diner, waiting again for permission she'd apparently decided she'd never simply take. My phone lit up in my bag, Brielle's name bright on the screen, 3 texts arriving in rapid succession, the buzzing loud and obscene in the small mirrored space. Celeste's hand dropped. The moment folded itself away as cleanly as if it had never opened at all, and she reached past me and pressed the button for the ground floor, jaw tight, composure reassembling itself in real time. "You should probably see what that's about," she said, and the 6 seconds of silence before the doors opened again were the longest of the entire night. Brielle's texts were exactly what I expected once I actually read them, hours later, alone. A photo had made its way to her. One of Celeste's employees, apparently, had seen us leave the gala lobby together and mentioned it somewhere it traveled. "Where were you tonight?" "Who were you with?" "Don't lie to me, Nora. I know you were with someone." The messages built from curious to accusing to something colder within the space of 40 minutes, culminating in one that made my stomach drop clean through the floor. "Please tell me it's not who I think it is." I didn't answer that night. I turned my phone face down on the counter and sat with it for a long time, feeling, absurdly, like I owed Celeste Rourke an explanation for a life she'd already made clear 6 months ago she no longer had any claim to. It took me 2 days to admit to myself that the silence wasn't kindness, it was fear. Fear of what saying it out loud would make real. Fear of the particular chaos Brielle was capable of when she felt something slipping out of her control that she hadn't wanted until she was losing it. She showed up at my studio on the 3rd day, uninvited, mascara already smudged in a way that looked suspiciously deliberate. "Is it true?" "Is what true, Brielle?" "Don't do that. Don't make me say it." She paced my small entryway, arms crossed, every gesture calibrated for maximum effect even now, even genuinely upset, because performance had become so instinctive to her that I doubted she could separate it from feeling anymore. "You and Celeste. My sister, Nora." "Nothing has happened," I said, which was, in the strictest technical sense, still true. "But you want it to." I didn't answer fast enough, and Brielle's face did something complicated. Hurt and fury and something almost like vindication all at once, like some small ugly part of her was relieved to have proof that I'd moved on to someone, even if the someone was the one person guaranteed to cost her the most. "She only wants what I had," Brielle said, low, cruel in the specific practiced way she'd always been cruelest, aiming for the exact soft place she knew existed in me. "That's all this is. Celeste doesn't want you, Nora. She wants to win. She's spent her whole life competing with me without ever admitting it, and you're just the easiest way to do it where I'll actually notice." I want to say I didn't believe her, not even for a second. That would be a lie. I believed her for almost a full week. Believed it enough that I stopped answering Celeste's texts, stopped picking up when she called, let the coat sit unwashed on its hook while I tried to convince myself that wanting Celeste Rourke had only ever been a symptom of missing her sister. Some substitution my grief had engineered because the shapes were similar enough to trick a broken heart. Celeste didn't chase me during that week, and I understood later that the restraint had cost her something significant, because when she finally did show up, no envelope this time, no excuse at all, she looked like a woman who had lost an argument with herself several times over before allowing herself to knock. "I'm not here to convince you of anything," she said, standing on my landing in the rain again, an echo of the first night that neither of us acknowledged out loud. "I only want to say one thing, and then I'll leave if you want me to. Whatever my sister told you about why I'm here, she's wrong. I've spent my entire life cleaning up rooms Brielle set on fire, smoothing things over so my parents wouldn't have to feel the consequences of the daughter they preferred. I have never once, in 34 years, done a single selfish thing." Her voice didn't break. "Exactly. But something underneath it went thin and raw. You are the first selfish thing I have ever wanted, Nora. Not because you belong to her first, because of who you are when nobody's watching, which is a version of you I don't think my sister ever actually saw. She said you only want what she had." "I don't want anything she had," Celeste said, quiet and precise, the courtroom control returning just enough to steady the words. "I want you. That's a different sentence entirely, and I need you to hear the difference, because I refuse to be reduced to a competition with my own sister over a person I've thought about every single day since long before that party." Something in me, some last offended wall I'd been holding up out of fear more than conviction, came down. "How long," I asked, "is long before that party?" Celeste looked at me for a long moment, weighing, I think, whether the honest answer would cost her more than the careful one. 18 months, she finally said. "I never acted on it. You were with my sister, and I have spent my whole life believing wanting things I shouldn't have was a character flaw to be managed, rather than a truth to be told. I'm telling you the truth now because the alternative is losing you to a lie she's using because it's easier than admitting she never actually treated you the way you deserve to be treated, and I would rather lose you honestly than keep you on false premises." I stepped toward her. I want that detail remembered clearly, because it mattered to both of us that it happened this way. Not Celeste closing a distance I hadn't chosen, not some inevitability she engineered, but me, finally, choosing it myself, closing the last foot of space on my own landing in the rain, and kissing her before either of us could talk ourselves back out of it. She made a small sound against my mouth, surprised, and then her hand came up to my jaw. Finally, the touch she'd been hovering an inch away from for weeks, and kissed me back like something in her had been waiting a very long time for exactly this permission. It wasn't careful. It wasn't the composed, controlled Celeste Rourke the whole city seemed to be afraid of. It was breathless and a little desperate, her fingers curling into the collar of my jacket, my hands fisting in the front of her coat, the rain forgotten around us entirely. When we finally broke apart, foreheads still touching, both of us breathing like we'd run somewhere, Celeste laughed, actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound I'd never once heard from her. "I have cross-examined hostile witnesses with less nerve than I just needed to knock on your door." "You didn't seem nervous." "I never seem anything," she said. "That's rather the whole problem. We didn't sleep together that night, though I won't pretend the thought didn't cross both our minds more than once. Instead, we sat on my couch until nearly 3 in the morning. Her coat, finally back on her own shoulders where it belonged, though she kept one arm around me the entire time like she wasn't ready to test the theory that I might not still be there in the morning. Talking in the unhurried, confessional way you only talk after the hardest sentence has already been said out loud. She told me about being 9 years old and learning to disappear, so her parents' attention could stay fixed on whichever crisis Brielle had generated that week. I told her about photographing other people's weddings for 6 years, and never once being asked to be the one in the dress. We didn't solve anything. We didn't need to. Not that night. We just sat in the fact of it, together, for the first time. The trouble started, as trouble in that family always seemed to, At a dinner none of us should have agreed to attend. Mrs. Rourke had organized a small gathering under the pretense of discussing wedding logistics for Brielle, and Celeste, in a decision I would later understand as a deliberate test of her own nerve, brought me along as her guest, plainly, without apology, for the first time in either of our lives. The temperature in that dining room dropped the second we walked in together. Brielle went white, then a hard, furious red. Mr. Rourke's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Mrs. Rourke set down her wineglass with the exaggerated care of a woman deciding not to throw it. "Celeste," she said, voice pleasant in the specific, dangerous way that meant it wasn't a word in the kitchen. I heard most of it anyway, because the kitchen door didn't close all the way, and because Mrs. Rourke, for all her polish, had never learned to modulate her voice when she was truly upset. "Think about what this looks like. Think about your father's firm, the clients we depend on, the talk this will generate before Brielle's wedding is even finalized. She was your sister's girlfriend, Celeste. There are things a family simply does not do to itself." "I'm not doing anything to this family," Celeste said, and her voice, unlike her mother's, stayed perfectly level. "I'm choosing someone. That's all this is. If the family can't survive that without a scandal narrative, the family has a larger problem than my personal life." "You have always been the reasonable one," Mrs. Rourke said, and I heard, underneath the words, decades of a particular kind of weaponized praise, the sentence that had apparently been used to keep Celeste small and useful, and endlessly self-sacrificing since she was a child. "Don't throw that away over this." "I am not throwing anything away," Celeste said. "I am finally taking something. There's a difference, and I'd have thought a woman who spent her life managing appearances would understand it better than most." She came back to the table a few minutes later, expression composed, and reached under the tablecloth to find my hand, holding it there through the rest of an unbearable dinner, with a grip that told me exactly how much that conversation had cost her, even though her face gave away nothing at all. It didn't end there, of course. Brielle cornered me in the hallway on our way out, voice low and shaking. "You're really doing this. After everything, you're going to let her turn me into the villain of my own family." "Nobody's making you the villain, Brielle. You did some of that yourself, and I did some of it too, and none of it has anything to do with this." "She's going to get bored of you," Brielle said, ugly and desperate now, reaching for whatever weapon was closest. "She gets bored of everything that isn't a case she can win. You're a project to her, Nora. A good deed. The minute you stop needing rescuing, she won't know what to do with you." I felt that one land, somewhere old and tender, some fear I'd been carrying since the diner, since the coat, since every single time Celeste had shown up precisely when I was falling apart. I didn't have a clean answer for Brielle that night. I just walked out to the car, and Celeste, reading something in my silence on the drive home, went quiet too, and by the time she dropped me at my apartment, neither of us had said much at all. I told Marin about the dinner 2 days later, sitting on my studio floor surrounded by the auction gala's proof sheets, and she listened to the whole thing. Mrs. Rourke's kitchen ultimatum, Brielle's hallway ambush, the ugly, effective way Brielle's words about being a project, a good deed, had lodged themselves somewhere tender and stayed there, without once interrupting, which for Marin was its own quiet act of love. "Okay," she said, when I finally ran out of words. "Here's what I know, having watched you for 4 years make yourself smaller, so nobody around you would have to deal with an inconvenient amount of Nora. You didn't get quiet with Celeste. You got loud tonight. In a hallway, in a hard family dinner, you told your ex-girlfriend's mother, essentially, to reconsider her priorities. That's not what being somebody's rescue project looks like. That's what being somebody's actual partner looks like. On a bad night, doing the work alongside her, instead of hiding from it. What if Brielle's right, though? What if the minute Celeste doesn't have anything to fix, she gets bored? Then you'll find out, Marin said, simply, same as the rest of us find out anything worth knowing about a person, by staying long enough to see what happens when the crisis runs out. But Nora, you have spent 8 months treating your own heart like evidence in a trial you're terrified of losing. At some point, you have to just let yourself want something without cross-examining it first. She bumped her shoulder against mine, the closest Marin ever got to sentimentality without immediately undercutting it with a joke. Also, for what it's worth, The woman drove 4 hours out of her way and made objectively terrible coffee for you at 1 in the morning. That's not boredom math. That's just love, being clumsy about it. That silence stretched into distance over the following 2 weeks. Celeste pulled back first. Fewer texts, a canceled dinner, an excuse about a difficult trial that might even have been true. I told myself I understood. I told myself this was Celeste protecting me from the fallout the way she'd apparently spent her whole life protecting everyone from everything, absorbing consequences so no one else had to. But understanding it didn't make it hurt less, and somewhere in that stretch of silence, Brielle's words started to feel less like an accusation and more like a prophecy I was watching complete itself in real time. I didn't fall apart, though. That was new, and I noticed it happening, almost from the outside, like watching someone else finally learn a lesson I'd been failing for years. I spent some of that silence being honest with myself about a fear I hadn't wanted to look at directly. That maybe I was only drawn to Celeste because she was strong in exactly the places I currently felt broken. That I'd mistaken being rescued for being loved because the two had gotten tangled together somewhere in that first rainy car ride. I turned it over for days, the way you probe a bruise to see if it still hurts. What I found when I was finally honest wasn't rescue, it was recognition. Celeste had never once treated me like a problem to be solved. She'd handed me a towel for a camera strap instead of asking if I was okay. She'd let me cry without trying to fix it. She'd told me the truth about her sister only when I was steady enough to hear it, and not a moment before. Rescue takes something from you to make itself necessary. Celeste had only ever given me room. There was a difference, and once I finally saw it clearly, the fear that had been quietly eating at the edges of everything simply had nowhere left to stand. I went back to work. I took on 3 new clients. I framed one of the accidental photographs of Celeste from the party, the one where she was watching me across the ballroom, unguarded, before either of us had said anything true out loud, and hung it in my studio, not as a shrine, but as a kind of promise to myself that whatever happened next, I wasn't going to let someone else's fear decide what my own heart meant. When Celeste finally called, 10 days later, I let it ring twice before I picked up. "I've been an idiot," she said, without preamble, which was so unlike her that I almost laughed. "A little, yeah? I told myself I was protecting you. From my mother, from the talk, from becoming a story people tell at fundraisers. What I was actually doing was letting my family teach me the same lesson they've been teaching me since I was 9 years old. That wanting something for myself is a liability to be managed, rather than a life to be lived." A pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone rougher, more unguarded than I'd ever heard it. "I don't want to manage this, Nora. I want to be in it, loudly, if necessary, publicly, if it comes to that. I should have said that 2 weeks ago, instead of disappearing." "You should have," I agreed, "but I'm glad you're saying it now." There's a gala at the end of the month, the Rourke Foundation's annual fundraiser, my father's event, half the legal community in Portland, cameras, press, all of it. I already told my mother I'm bringing you, not as my sister's replacement girlfriend's replacement, or whatever unkind arithmetic she's doing in her head. As mine. That sounds like exactly the kind of scandal she was trying to prevent. "It is," Celeste said, and for the first time I heard something like relief in her voice, like she'd finally stopped fighting the fact of what she wanted. "I'm done managing it." The Rourke Foundation Gala took over the entire top floor of a downtown hotel, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city gone gold and glittering at dusk, a jazz quartet working through something slow near the bar, waitstaff moving through the crowd with trays of champagne that caught the light every time someone lifted a glass. I was there in 2 capacities that night, which was its own particular kind of vertigo, hired, officially, as the event photographer, and unofficially, undeniably, as Celeste Rourke's date, a distinction the entire room seemed to be working very hard to parse as I moved through it with a camera in one hand. Celeste found me within the first 20 minutes, materializing at my elbow in a dark green gown that made the whole room recalibrate around her, the way rooms always seem to when she entered them, and rested one hand briefly, deliberately, at the small of my back, in front of at least a dozen people who mattered enormously to her father's firm. "You're supposed to be circulating," I said, low, aware of eyes on us. I am circulating. This is circulating. She didn't move her hand. Mr. Rourke found us near the auction tables an hour later, his expression carefully neutral in a way that told me exactly how much effort neutral was costing him. Celeste, a word about the Hendricks account, when you have a moment, not a request. Celeste held his gaze for one long beat, then looked at me, then back at her father. I'll be there in a moment. Nora, would you excuse us? She squeezed my hand once, quick and certain, before following him toward the terrace doors, and I understood, watching her go, that this was its own small act of defiance. She'd made him wait, made him watch her choose the order of her priorities in front of half the room, and that alone had cost her something, with a man who'd spent her whole life expecting immediate compliance. I was photographing the silent auction table 20 minutes later, when Brielle found me, dressed in ivory that was very nearly, very deliberately, the color of a wedding gown, though her own wedding was still months off. She'd clearly been drinking, not enough to be sloppy, but enough to loosen whatever restraint might otherwise have kept her from doing what she did next, which was to raise her voice, in the middle of a room full of judges and donors and press photographers from 3 local outlets, and ask, bright and cutting and pitched to carry, "So is this the part where my sister's employee gets promoted to girlfriend in front of the whole donor list? Or are we all still pretending this is professional?" The room's noise dipped, that particular hush that happens when a crowd senses blood in the water, and leans in without meaning to. A photographer from the Business Journal actually lifted his camera. I felt my whole body go hot and cold at once, every old instinct screaming at me to shrink, apologize, disappear, the way I'd learned to disappear at 100 family gatherings I hadn't been important enough to disrupt. I didn't shrink. "I'm not her employee," I said, loud enough to carry exactly as far as Brielle's question had, camera still in my hand, because some part of me needed something to hold on to. "I'm a professional photographer she hired for tonight, the same way I was hired for your engagement party, where I did my job well despite the fact that watching you fall in love with someone else in real time was, frankly, one of the more painful nights of my year. I'm also, separately, someone your sister is choosing to be with, which is a decision that belongs to the 2 of us and no one else in this room, including you." Brielle's face did something complicated, fury still there, but shock underneath it too, like she hadn't expected me to have a spine left after everything. "You don't get to make this about scandal management, Brielle," I went on, and my voice, to my own surprise, didn't shake. "You broke my heart 8 months ago because you loved being loved more than you ever learned how to love anyone back. Celeste told me that once, gently, and I didn't want to hear it, and I should have. I'm not the villain in your story for finally being with someone who actually sees me. And you don't get to weaponize a room full of your father's donors to punish me for surviving you." Somewhere behind me I heard Celeste's voice, sharper than I'd ever heard it, cutting through the hush. "That's enough, Brielle." She'd come back from the terrace at exactly the wrong, or exactly the right moment, and she crossed the room now with a kind of controlled fury that made half the crowd take an involuntary step back. The same energy, I imagined, that made prosecutors reconsider their entire case strategy. But she didn't take over. She didn't sweep in and rescue me from a confrontation I'd apparently already finished handling myself. She stopped beside me, not in front of me, and put her hand at my back again, in full view of everyone, deliberate and unhurried. "Nora doesn't need me to fight her battles," Celeste said, to Brielle, to the room, to her father, who I could see now standing rigid near the terrace doors, to her mother, who had gone the particular shade of pale that meant a scandal narrative was already assembling itself behind her eyes. "She just handled that better than I could have. What I need to say, since apparently tonight is the night we're saying things in front of donors, is that I am with her, not as an act of rebellion against this family, not to win some competition Brielle apparently thinks we've been running our whole lives, because she is, without question, the best decision I have ever allowed myself to make, and I am done pretending otherwise for anyone's comfort." The silence that followed was long enough that I heard the jazz quartet finish a phrase and start another before anyone spoke. It was Mr. Rourke, finally, who broke it, crossing the room with none of his wife's careful neutrality, his expression unreadable until he stopped in front of Celeste and, astonishingly, looked more tired than angry. "You've spent your whole life managing this family's messes without once asking anything for yourself," he said, quiet enough now that it wasn't for the room anymore, just for us. "I don't know how to argue with you wanting something, Celeste. I'm not sure I have the right to." He looked at me then, assessing, the same sharp attention I'd seen Celeste use on hostile witnesses, though softer at the edges. "Ms. Whitlock, I apologize for my daughter's behavior tonight. Both of them, if I'm honest, though for very different reasons." Brielle didn't apologize. She left the gala within the hour, ivory dress and wounded pride, and I understood, watching her go, that this particular ending wasn't going to be tied up neatly with reconciliation. Some relationships just end, imperfectly, with both people still a little unfinished, and that had to be allowed to be enough. Celeste and I stayed until the last of the auction items sold, until the jazz quartet packed up their instruments, until the catering staff started folding tablecloths around us. She didn't let go of my hand the entire time. Not once, not even when 3 separate donors made pointed comments about discretion that she answered with a flat, pleasant smile and absolutely no explanation at all. The weeks after the gala didn't unfold like some tidy epilogue where every loose thread got tied off in a bow. Mrs. Rourke took nearly 2 months to say a civil word to me, and when she finally did, it was a stiff, formal invitation to a dinner I suspected Celeste had strong-armed her into extending, and I went, and it was awkward, and it was also, in its own small way, a beginning. Mr. Rourke turned out to be easier than I expected, gruffly complimentary about a print I'd given Celeste for her office, a black and white shot of the river from the night she'd parked us there, and guarded my sleep without waking me. Brielle and I didn't speak again for a long time. When we finally did, months later, at a mutual friend's birthday dinner neither of us had known the other was attending, it was brief and careful, and almost kind. Not friendship, not yet, maybe not ever entirely, but no longer a wound either of us had to keep tending. Celeste changed too, in ways so gradual I almost missed them happening. She started leaving the office before 8, most nights, instead of after 10. She learned, slowly, humiliatingly, under my extremely patient tutelage, to make coffee that didn't taste like a legal proceeding. She stopped, mostly, apologizing for wanting things. A slower Sunday, a weekend with no depositions, my hand in hers in public without calculating first who might be watching and what it might cost her. I watched a woman who'd spent 34 years managing everyone else's comfort, slowly, deliberately, learn to take up a little more space in her own life, and I don't think I've ever been prouder of anything I had a small hand in helping happen. My studio grew too, in the months that followed. Word travels fast in a city that size, and there is apparently no better advertisement for a photographer than being seen, once, standing your ground in front of half the legal community of Portland. I booked 2 gallery openings, then a third, small shows of the kind of work I'd never quite had the confidence to pursue, while I was busy making myself smaller for other people's comfort. Celeste came to every single one, standing near the back the way she used to stand near doorways at her family's parties, watching me the way she'd watched me that very first night. Except now, when I caught her at it, she didn't just hold my gaze and let it go. She crossed the room every time. My first solo show opened on a clear night in early autumn, almost exactly a year after that rain-soaked engagement party where all of this had started. The gallery sat 2 blocks from my old apartment, in a part of the city I used to walk through on the way to work, without a single reason to look up, and I stood in the middle of it that evening, surrounded by 24 framed prints. Portraits, mostly, faces caught in unguarded moments, the kind of photography I'd spent years too afraid to put my name on, and felt something settle in my chest that I didn't have a word for yet except, maybe, arrived. Celeste found me near the back wall, where I'd hung the accidental photograph from the engagement party without telling her, the one of her watching me across the ballroom before either of us had said anything true. She stood in front of it for a long moment, quiet, and I watched her throat move. "You kept this." "I framed it the week we weren't speaking," I admitted. I told myself it was a reminder not to let anyone else's fear decide what my own heart meant. Turned out it was mostly just a reminder of you. She didn't answer with words. She took my hand instead, right there in the middle of a room full of people who knew exactly who we were to each other now, and had stopped finding it scandalous months ago, and held it through the rest of the opening like she had no intention of letting go, which, as it turned out, she didn't. Not that night, and not, as I would learn, for a very long time afterward. It was nearly midnight when we finally left, the gallery emptied out, the last of my prints sold or promised, and Celeste's car waiting at the curb, the same black vintage Mercedes, the same worn leather seats that still, faintly, after everything, smelled like cedar and rain. I climbed in tired and happy, and lighter than I think I'd ever been, and Celeste pulled away from the curb into a city gone quiet and gold under the streetlights, and I only realized, 3 blocks later, that she'd turned the wrong way. Celeste. I sat up, twisting to look behind us at the street where my old apartment building sat dark and unremarkable, already sliding out of view. You missed the turn. I know, Celeste said, and this time there was nothing careful or controlled about the small, unguarded smile that crossed her face. Nothing hidden behind the words at all. You always do this, I said, laughing despite myself, despite the echo of it, despite the fact that my heart had gone soft and full and slightly ridiculous in my chest. 1 year later, and you still can't drive past my apartment without missing the turn. I only miss it, Celeste said, glancing over at me at a red light, her hand finding mine on the seat between us, certain now, in a way, it hadn't dared to be that first rainy night, when the road ahead is better. And where's the road going tonight? The coast, she said. I bought a house 2 months ago, I haven't told you about yet, because I wanted the first time you saw it to be exactly like this. No warning, no chance to talk yourself out of coming, just the 2 of us and a long stretch of highway, and absolutely nowhere either of us has to be by morning. You bought a house. I bought a house, Celeste confirmed, with a porch that faces the water and a kitchen I fully intend to ruin your coffee expectations in for the rest of both our lives, if you'll let me. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just looked at her, at the woman who'd once stood in doorways watching a family perform happiness she wasn't allowed to want any of for herself, at the woman who'd driven a soaked and heartbroken photographer past her own apartment on a rainy night because she'd recognized, in one unguarded expression, a grief she'd spent her whole life learning to hide, and felt, for the first time since I could remember, entirely unafraid of where a road might lead. Drive, I said. And she did, out past the last of the city lights, the ocean, somewhere ahead of us in the dark, both of us finally, fully, going somewhere together, because we'd chosen it, and not because either of us had anywhere else left to run.